Welcome back to the second annual Rochester Hills Public Library Author Fair, hosted in conjunction with Rochester Writers. For Rochester Writers, my name is Michael Dwyer, and joining us for this author segment is Dorene O'Brien. Dorene, it's so good to see you.
Thank you, Michael. I am thrilled to be here, and thank you for having me.
Now, we just got done seeing a slideshow of images, which is kind of a teaser about the stories that are in your new book. Tell us about your new book.
Well, the book is a story collection called What It Might Feel Like to Hope. And I had a very difficult time titling the book because I couldn't find that thread in the stories. And when I wasn't thinking too hard about it, I realized there's hope woven throughout all of these stories. And sometimes the hope is very small and very minimal, but they are generally hopeful stories, which, if anyone's familiar with my earlier work, this is a departure. My earlier work is much darker. And some of these are actually humorous. The first story in the book is called 8 Blind Dates Later, and it features a protagonist whose mother fixes him up with 8 different women after his girlfriend dumps him. And you can't write that very seriously. So I'm playing a little bit with the idea of the romance genre, and I include some of that. But then there are serious stories. There is quite a serious story called The Turn of the Wind about a scientist. He's a crystallographer who is diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And of course, he then has difficulty continuing his work. And so he starts conflating the crystals with his life. I'm someone who loves to conduct research, and I include it in my stories in very subtle ways, because I love stories that teach me something as I read them, something I didn't know. And so you'll see, you're going to learn a little bit about mortuary science, and you'll learn something about herb farming and growing and how herbs are used. You'll learn about the history of Corktown. You'll learn about ancient classic violins. So the book may seem like there's a lot of disparate topics, but hope is what weaves them all together. And that's how I explain the collage that you saw prior to the interview. All of these images, these characters, these props do occur somewhere in the book.
And now, are these all 100% true stories, or all made up, or a blending?
These, the only truth in the book are the historical details, such as when casinos came to Detroit. This is a book of fiction. So as I say, the research is true. Oddly, I did a lot of research on mythology for The Turn of the Wind, and the mythology, the mythological stories and characters are true, such as stories can be true. But these definitely are works of fiction. I'll admit, drive around Corktown and look at the architecture, because oddly, the irony is that we want fiction to feel so real that we utterly buy this could be the truth. So there's truth in the architecture, there's truth in the research that I do on crystals or on herbs, but really at the end of the day, these are not my experiences, these are not experiences of people I know, these are fiction stories.
But with one message about hope, and different than your previous books. Could you touch a little bit on your previous books and what their titles were?
Yeah, my first book was also a short story collection called Voices of the Lost and Found. And this book really is 11 stories, first person narrators, and these narrators were all in serious trouble. One story was narrated by a young girl who had been kidnapped, taken to a cabin in the Catskills, and raped by a lunatic. Another story was narrated by a young man who got in with a very disturbed high school friend and ended up on a interstate crime spree, robbing stores. And there was a poet turned prostitute story. There's a story about 3 men who work at a fishery and kill their cruel boss and dismember him and feed him to the fish. So I was in a dark place then, working out a lot of darkness. Oddly, I think we're in a dark place historically now. Maybe I'm creating the hope that I think we all need in this book. My second book was called Oven Birds and Other Stories, and I have to say that was a bridge perhaps to this current book, What It Might Feel Like to Hope. It was more hopeful, not quite as dark. So I see a kind of an arc in my work from less dark to more hopeful, which I have to say I find ironic because, as I said, I think we're living in pretty dark times now. Maybe this is a way to combat or temper that darkness, writing more hopeful stories.
Well, I'm pleased that you are embracing the light of hope and making a transition from some of those darker stories. And there's a lot of people, especially in the spiritual world, that do think we're in a transitional time, and that things around the corner will be better. We are looking at a bright future as a species, as a humanity, all living together on this planet. And I have to believe that, because what's the alternative? So
I concur. I agree. I think maybe writers are generally tapping into this kind of collective unconscious belief that things can only get better, or that we're trying to collectively generate the hope we need so that things will get better. I, like you, am hoping that as a species we've learned, rock bottom is only a good place to be when you realize that you can only go up and you have to do something to make yourselves transcend. So I hope this is that moment. I hope this is where we are.
Well, I agree with you. I hope we are headed in a positive direction, and I know we are. I know we're headed in a positive direction. There are stumbling blocks along the way, and there's opinions and beliefs and arguments along the way, and those people may not agree, and they may be right, they may be wrong. It may not matter what their opinions or beliefs are. I just think we're headed in a positive direction.
Well, then my trajectory, my writing and book trajectory is mirroring or paralleling that trajectory. So that pleases me. So, a couple other things, I'd like to say about the book is that um, I tend to be a literary writer, and what people have said is that most literary writers write about the upper crust, wealthier people. When you think of John Updike, you think about his concerns and what he wrote about. But I do write about people who, in this book, um, they're working people. They are middle-class people, even people in the lower stratums of the social caste. That has always been my concern. People ask me all the time, this seems so real. Did this happen to you? And I say, no, my life is boring. I need fiction. I want to learn about the lives of other people, which is why I write about morticians, or I write about herbalists, or I write about people who are writing zombie stories for Tom Hanks. This is interesting to me because it's not my life. I admire people who write essays and write memoirs and can find interesting things in their own lives that they are willing to share. That is very impressive to me. I've tried to do it. I've published a couple of essays, but fiction, and especially fiction concerning people very unlike me, interests me most. When my first book came out, there were stories narrated by lower educated, uneducated middle-aged men, prostitutes, a Detroit tagger, a graffiti artist. And I read from my book at a little store up north on the Leelanau Peninsula. And I had only been in communication with the owner of the store via email, so we'd never met. And she lived a couple hours away from her store, so she was not involved in the day-to-day operations. And I remember right before my reading at her store, she came running in. She said, "Where's the author?" And I said, "Here I am." And she looked me up and down and she said, "Oh, well, after reading your book, I didn't know if you were going to be Black or white or Asian or Indian, but you're just a boring white woman." And I thought, you're right. I am. I like to write about other people. My life is not interesting, but I took it as a compliment that she thought I was able to inhabit those other voices, those other personalities, those other cultures, because it would be very easy and heartbreaking to co-opt someone else's culture and then insult them, or use a bad dialect or something stereotypical. So dabbling in voices, that's where I was back then, and I found it very fulfilling. While these are not all first person narrations in my most recent release, they are still personalities and characters very different than I am.
Well, and it takes a good author, a good writer to grab the voice of our protagonists and the characters of our stories. It takes a lot of research, and I would say that there's a lot of journalism in you, journalistic approaches to doing the research and embracing those characters. But don't cut yourself short. You are interesting, Dorene.
Well, insofar as you can see me in my characters, perhaps. And it's funny you should say that about the journalism bent. I do have a bachelor's degree in journalism as well as in English. And so I think that research aspect in my work, it comes by me naturally. It's fun to do. And as I say, my favorite stories are ones that are quietly instructional, not didactic. So I'm learning about other characters, and I'm learning about interesting. I actually, for the story with the crystallographer, I bought a crystal growing kit. You can get them at Michael's or at the science store, and I grew crystals so that I could see the process. Well, the first version of that story was a horrific story because it was Dorene O'Brien showing off how much she knew about crystallography. So it was too cerebral, it was really boring. And so I then put it aside for a while, like most writers do. And then I started getting to know my character. And then crystallography took the back seat to the character's story of how he's struggling with Alzheimer's and how he's trying to create a new life, making weather vanes with mythological figures. So that explains one of the slides on the slideshow that we saw earlier. So I have to learn, like everyone else, to balance the stories between the research and between the characters. And the characters in the story are always more important. And in terms of these first-person stories, I always joke about this, but I do say this to my students. On the first day of class, I ask them how many hear voices in their heads. And half of them raise their hands and the other half drop. But if you hear voices in your head as a writer, you are going to be a very good dialogue writer and probably really good at the first person narrative. So once I think I tackled that to the ground and felt good about it, I moved on to other perspectives, and I feel comfortable now with all perspectives. But even though I've been writing for a long time, I feel like I'm still always learning and growing. It's a very long apprenticeship. Any writer who says, I've learned everything I can, I've arrived, I'm finished, is an arrogant writer to me. I think it's a lifelong pursuit. Writing is always changing. There's so many hybrid genres we never had before. So we can always learn to write in a new form, a new genre, a new style. So I don't think as writers we ever arrive. I mean, money is one thing. If you've made a bunch of money, you might feel you've arrived. But as far as your craft and pursuing your training, I think that never ends. And I like that.
Well, absolutely. I mean, we never get to the end of everything we want to do. Life takes a different path, and eventually that ceases to give us any more days to do those things. But you're never done, and we're writing more material, you're researching more material. There's projects that you won't get to. There's ideas that float by and float out, and but that's just the life of being a human and being an author and being a writer and a storyteller.
Oh, absolutely. I recently read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and he claims, unlike Freud, who said life was about pleasure, he said life was about pursuing things that are meaningful to you personally. And your life has purpose outside of yourself, not internal pleasure. And I think that's exactly what you just said in different words, that writers or sculptors or painters, they will constantly pursue creation outside of themselves. And as a result, their lives have purpose. And you're right, we will die before we've finished everything we've wanted to complete. But that is the nature, I think, of artistry and of living a life of purpose and creation.
Well, the story that you haven't been able to tell, someone else will down the road. And so your thoughts are not in vain. It's just part of the experience. I want to remind everyone we are speaking with Dorene O'Brien, and she is an author here on the Authors Fair. Remind everyone the name of the book and where to go to find out more about you and maybe to buy that book.
The name of the book is What It Might Feel Like to Hope. It's for sale, obviously, on Amazon, though I prefer people, if they want to buy the book, buy it through IndieBound or through Sundance or through a local bookseller. If you go to indiebound.com and put in your zip code, they will actually give you a list of local bookstores that sell the book if you want to support your local proprietor. And that would be the preference for me. But as I say, I know we're all in lockdown. Amazon is simpler for people. So it's available in multiple locations. Again, I know it's kind of a long title, What It Might Feel Like to Hope. It's a title I fought for. My editor did not want the title, thought it was too long, but the publisher luckily took my side and said, nope, that's the title we want. That's what we're going with. So that's where you can buy the book.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dorene O'Brien, for joining us today on the second annual Authors Fair. We're going to leave it with that, and we'll be back in a moment with another author.